History is often written in the ink of unintended consequences. Occasionally, a titan makes a move so fundamentally misjudged that it triggers a cascade of events far beyond their control or comprehension. We are currently living through such a moment. What began as a standard tariff campaign by Donald Trump, intended to bludgeon Canada into a state of quiet compliance, has instead ignited a global conflagration that Washington is only now beginning to perceive in its terrifying totality. Under the leadership of Mark Carney, Canada did not simply absorb the blow, it redirected the energy of the strike back into the global system. In doing so, Ottawa has set the world on fire. This wasn't just a trade dispute, it was the activation of a new global alignment, diplomatic, institutional, and economic. It has forced allies into unconventional partnerships, revived dormant international bodies, and sent a definitive signal to every capital on Earth. The era of uncontested American economic coercion has met its match. It is a staggering irony that the fatal error at the heart of this collapse was committed by an administration that viewed leverage as its primary language. The mistake wasn't just tactical, it was a structural and psychological failure that may prove irreversible. To understand why this move backfired, we must look at the flawed blueprint Washington used. The administration's strategy was built on a superficial truth. Canada sends 75% of its exports to the United States. On a spreadsheet, that looks like total vulnerability. The logic seemed foolproof. A neighbor that dependent on your market cannot afford to resist. But that analysis missed the structural reality. The relationship isn't a one-way street, it's a shared nervous system. The production networks of North America are so deeply integrated that any attempt to wound Canada results in a self-inflicted hemorrhage for American industry. The deeper error, however, was psychological. Trump's team assumed that Canada would perform a simple cost-benefit analysis and choose the path of least resistance. They expected Mark Carney, a newcomer to the Prime Minister's office, to prioritize the optics of diplomacy over the substance of a fight. They bet on global apathy, assuming the world would watch with mild pity but stay on the sidelines. They were wrong on every count. The transformation of this bilateral friction into a global crisis happened through four distinct strategic movements. 1. Surgical retaliation. Canada's counter-tariffs weren't blunt instruments. They were targeted with an intimate understanding of American political geography, hitting the districts of key power brokers with high-precision economic pain. 2. The energy pivot. By redirecting strategic oil and mineral resources toward European and Asian partners, Carney didn't just find new buyers. He introduced a permanent risk premium into the American energy landscape. 3. The legal front. By filing aggressive USMCA and WTO challenges, Canada moved the fight from the court of public opinion to the court of binding law, forcing a global conversation about whether American treaty commitments were worth the paper they were printed on. 4. The coalition of the willing. Carney embarked on a diplomatic blitz, positioning Canada as the vanguard of a new, rules-based trading order. This attracted immediate alignment from the EU, Japan, and the Indo-Pacific, turning a trade row into a global referendum on American unilateralism. To see where we are going, we must look at where we have been. There are three critical precedents for a middle power successfully breaking a great power's grip: de Gaulle's France, 1960s. When de Gaulle withdrew from NATO's integrated command, Washington predicted chaos. Instead, it forced a recalibration that made NATO more resilient and genuinely multilateral. The 1970s, developing bloc. When a coalition of emerging nations demanded a new international economic order, they were initially dismissed. Yet, their defiance paved the way for the institutional reforms that define modern global governance. The EU Steel War. During Trump's first term, the EU met steel tariffs with targeted strikes and WTO litigation. They proved that they had the stomach for a long-range economic war, which fundamentally changed the leverage in subsequent negotiations. Canada sits at the intersection of all these precedents. It is a G7 member, a Five Eyes partner, and the most integrated U.S. ally. When a country with that much to lose decides to burn the bridge rather than cross it, the global impact is qualitatively different. The global fire Canada lit is currently consuming 5 distinct arenas of the international order. 1. The alliance architecture. We are witnessing a fundamental de-risking of the American alliance. European and Pacific partners are no longer content with an American-led structure where they are expected to be silent juniors. Canada's resistance has provided a normative framework for a multipolar West, one that functions with or without American consistency. 2. The global trading system. At the very moment American unilateralism threatened to kill the WTO, Canada breathed life back into it. By rallying a coalition around the rules-based order, Ottawa has ensured that the framework of international trade will persist, even if the U.S. remains in retreat. 3. The energy realignment. The North American energy map is being redrawn. Canada's diversification deals aren't temporary. They are structural shifts that will redirect Alberta's resources to Asia and Europe for decades, permanently raising the cost of energy security for U.S. manufacturers. 4. The diplomatic gravity. Canada has emerged as the intellectual center for countries that are tired of being caught between major power rivalries. Carney has given the middle powers a vocabulary and a strategy, effectively ending the American monopoly on diplomatic leadership within the G7. 5. The American domestic front. The fire is burning inward. U.S. agricultural groups, energy titans, and manufacturers are now lobbying their own government with more ferocity than any foreign diplomat ever could. The internal pressure on the GOP coalition is becoming a primary source of political instability for the administration. This isn't an abstract theory. It is a crisis written in data. Supply chain flight. Logistics consultancies are documenting a mass migration of companies away from U.S.-only sourcing, as the reliability of the North American border can no longer be assumed. The market premium. Bond and currency markets are now pricing in a permanence of uncertainty. Traders are no longer treating this as a disruption. They are treating it as a structural change. IMF revisions. For the third time this year, the IMF has slashed North American growth forecasts, explicitly citing the trade war as the anchor dragging down the regional economy. Perhaps the most unexpected consequence of the fatal error is the internal effect on Canada itself. Instead of fracturing under the pressure, the country has entered its most unified era in decades. Carney's approval ratings are at historic highs, supported by a cross-partisan consensus that Canadian sovereignty is not for sale. Contrast this with the United States. The America First coalition is beginning to fray as the costs of the tariff campaign hit the grocery bills and gas tanks of the very people who voted for it. Farm state senators are increasingly at odds with the White House, and the business wing of the Republican Party is in open revolt. The world will not soon forget what this crisis revealed about American strategic thinking. 1. A lack of understanding. Washington proved it did not grasp the complexity of its own integrated economy. 2. A failure of estimation. The U.S. overestimated Canadian fear and underestimated Canadian grit. 3. The erosion of rules. The U.S. demonstrated that it views its own treaties, USMCA, NATO, WTO, as optional suggestions rather than binding commitments. In the world of high finance and high diplomacy, confidence is the only true currency. Once it is shattered, it cannot be rebuilt with a press release. The fire Canada lit is still burning. We are watching the birth of an international order that is more distributed, more multilateral, and far less dependent on the whims of a single capital. The fatal error of 2025 has ensured that the future will be defined by negotiation and contest, rather than simple American dictates. Canada has proved that even a middle power can change the course of history if it is brave enough to strike the match. The only question left is, when the smoke clears, what will be left of the American-led world?